All right. So this is going to be a new series. I'm actually pretty excited about this one. It's going to be my migration of my DZ Haven website. DZ Haven is a clone basically of Stack Overflow. You ask technical questions, you get back answers, except each question can have a bounty. So if somebody is able to answer the question, then they get paid the bounty. So this application is written 100% in JavaScript, TypeScript. The front end is React, Redux, React Router. These are some of the dependencies. I am also using GraphQL across the board. So if we take a look at the back end, you can see our GraphQL schema. And then this would be one of the resolvers. So I am using type-orm. And basically what you need to do is create a entity class. In my case, I am inheriting from, where is it? Auditable, because it has a lot of the fields that I'm just reusing. So you have annotations that describe the field. These are columns, obviously. And all you have to do is make sure that these names line up and that the types are somewhat similar. Of course, you can also add your own, how should I say, properties that aren't tied to the DB, but for your own uses, whatever that may be. And then doing a query most of the time is pretty straightforward, but there are some situations where the query might be more complicated, where it takes a little bit extra work. So on the front end, you've got React Router, Redux, and Apollo. This is my Redux setup. Just like everybody, I will have multiple reducers and their related actions. Actually, I should show you my index file. I'm using clustering. I'm also using the Redis store for my session state and cookies. One interesting thing is the Node app becomes middleware for the Apollo server, and then the Apollo server is sort of acting like the server. So that's the index file. And this is the app file. In my case, using the app file for all the routes. And I also have a single layout file. I might have to change some of this around because of the way Ionic works, which is what I'm going to be replacing this vanilla React with. Just to give you an example of what the client-side code for GraphQL might look like, all of my queries, all of my interaction with the DB is using GraphQL. So to log in, it's a mutation. To register, it's a mutation. I'm using TypeScript. So my props are typed, and then I'm using all hooks. So all of this is going away. I'm going to replace the front end with Ionic, but keep the other technologies like GraphQL, Redux, React Router. I am replacing the entire backend with Vertx because I found out that Vertx is much faster. It's one of the fastest frameworks on Tech and Power. This is a JavaScript version of Vertx. And then this is Rust. So you can see the difference in performance isn't all that much. Now, Vertx is written in Java, but I'm going to be using Kotlin because I like Kotlin better. Additionally, actually, by using Kotlin, I'm able to emit some of my code that I could possibly share on the client as JavaScript using Kotlin multi-platform. So some utility functions, validation functions, entity classes, I'll be able to emit all of that stuff so that I just write it once in Kotlin and then share it with my JavaScript client. So if you want to know more about doing that, you can see it in this video right here. So that's it. That's what we're going to be doing. Okay. So in case you don't know some of these technologies, Ionic is a UI framework. You might have heard some other stuff in regards to Ionic, but the Ionic portion itself is just a UI framework. That's all it is. So the reason why I'm picking it is because it's so attractive. It looks fantastic, but it fully supports React. So if you look at this, you can see this is all standard React syntax. It supports hooks, and everything looks really nice, crisp, and clean. I'm not much of a designer. This is, pretty simple, but I think this sort of design looks way better. Let's see. I don't think this is gonna... They have a few sample applications, but let's see. Navigation. I can't find any samples. But you'll see once we get started that it's a really attractive UI framework. So we're not going to be using any of the native stuff that's also part of Ionic, because I intend to just make a PWA, and when the time comes, just submit that to the app stores, both iOS and Android. So that's one major piece. And of course, I'm sure you guys already know what React is. Vertx will be the framework that I will be using for the server. It is a framework that is written in Java, but because it uses graphql-java under the covers, it actually supports multiple languages. And we will be using Kotlin, just because I prefer it. So that's another piece of tech. And then we will use a Apollo GraphQL on the front end, on the React side. There is no Apollo GraphQL for the Vertx piece. So for Vertx, we will be using this, which is GraphQL in Java. Since Kotlin is compatible, binary compatible on the JVM with Java, it's totally fine to use this framework, and that's what's going to give us server-side GraphQL. And since it is an industry standard, even though Apollo GraphQL is in the client side, everything is still compatible and it will work. I will not be using JWT. I will be using Redis session state to store authentication information. I don't think there's that much benefit in switching to JWT. You're going to have to unencrypt per call and hold the token somewhere anyway. So for me, it's not super urgent to do that. What else? Let's see here. And of course, on the React side, we're going to use Redux. We're going to use React Router. I am probably going to avoid using some of the specific to Ionic styling structural components. There's some good stuff in here, but if I'm going to use a grid mechanism, then I might as well just use the one built into CSS 3.0. So we're not going to use Flex Grid, we're going to use CSS grids. So wherever I can, I'm going to use the native web technologies, and only when I really need to am I going to use something in the framework, whether it be React or Ionic. Here's a sample that I found for some of the apps and companies that are using Ionic. If you look at the styling, the layout, everything looks really clean and professional. This is ionicframework.com customers. Then they have a sample app. It's a video conferencing application. This, I believe, uses Capacitor in addition to Ionic. Capacitor is not a GUI. It's just some under the covers functionality to tie into the native device. So some camera functionality and hardware functionality. But if you look at the UI, they have a built-in material design and an iOS design. It auto switches depending on which device you're on. But either one really looks very professional, very crisp, very clean. And for me, because I'm not a designer, it's pretty hard to come up with stuff like this. It would just take me an inordinate amount of time to do so. So they also have their own icons. So we'll be taking advantage of all of these design resources by using Ionic. All right, so as mentioned, the client is going to be Ionic. The current version is 5. So Ionic has its own sort of project build system. So we are going to use that. Side menu. So our project is React. It is TypeScript by default. We're not going to use Capacitor. Like I said, we're just going to build a PWA. So this does install quite a few packages. At the core, it's based on Create React App. So it does use React Router. So it's going to ask me, I'm going to say no. So then we're going to open the project. So in case you're not familiar with Ionic, as I said, it's the Ionic piece. There's multiple pieces to Ionic, but the Ionic piece itself is basically just a GUI library. So if we look at the index file, is nothing, standard boilerplate. But in the app file, this must be the root of your app, Ion app. And then in there, you have Ion React Router, which is a wrapper around React Router. And it basically allows some of the functionality, some of the controls within Ionic to connect with React Router. So there's that. This I will show you in a moment. And a router outlet is basically like the React Router switch statement. And you can have inside of it multiple routes. So if we take this and we run it, as you can see, it supports desktops. But if we pretend we have a phone, it will also support the phone. This sample application is some kind of email inbox app, but we're going to modify it so that it looks more like this, the DZ Haven application. So what I want to do is, instead of having, let's just get rid of all of these. Instead of having something like this on the left, I want to basically, in desktop mode, have menu items on the top like this, with the search button, with the logo. And then when it is on a mobile device, I wanted to have the little drop down. So in the mobile version, this is totally fine, and I like the way it swipes in. But on the desktop, I want to get rid of this and basically have it up here. So that's the first thing that I'm going to change. All right. So the way that we're going to do this is, this menu right here is the same as this menu. This menu. In this case, it's static. In the other case, it's dynamic. That menu is this right here. These are the two lists, like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a little tiny bit of code that basically has an if statement and it says, if this is a desktop, then return null, else return the menu. So I'll flesh this out some more and come back. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. So if this is a mobile device, we're going to return the menu as is. Obviously, we're going to update all the content inside of it. But if this is a desktop, then we have to return something else. Actually, for right here, we're going to return nothing at all. And then in the actual routes page, here's a sample of a page in Ionic. There is a header. And then what I'll do is I'll probably create a nav component that has all those menus and stuff in there pre-populated, so I can reuse it per page. Which actually reminds me to review this structure of an Ionic application. So as I said before, you have an Ion app control. This has to be at the root of your app. Then you have the Ion React router, which is a wrapper around React router. It works pretty much the same as React router. You have like a switch statement, and then you have the actual individual routes. This is here in order to give you the menu, the slide out of the menu. So that's why that's there. And then this was the actual menu. So then when you go to a route, you're going to a page in Ionic, which is called Ion page. So you could have multiple pages. And then in each page, you must have an Ion content. And you can have whatever you want in the Ion content. And optionally, you can have an Ion header. And again, you can have multiple pages. In each page, you can have individual React components. In this case, the base container does not have to be an Ionic control, but it can be. As you can see here, this is just a div tag. So that's the basic structure of an Ionic application. So what we're going to do is we're going to get this menu appropriately. If it's mobile, we're just going to give back the menu. If it's not, we're going to give back nothing. And then in the pages, we're also going to have a nav control that auto knows what to show depending on mobile or not. So the way that this has to be figured out by the app, I've actually already done in the existing DZ Haven application. So if I go to where is it? So if I go to layout, you'll see that I have these. So these are using the JavaScript window.matchMedia, and that is using basically CSS style syntax to figure out what the orientation of the screen is and what the resolutions are. So based upon this, I have some code that listens for those orientation switches. And then depending on those values, it will actually update the Redux global store with the current orientation. So then once it does that, whatever screen is subscribed to that Redux store, whatever component is subscribed to that Redux store, it's going to know what the current orientation is, and therefore for its own self, it's going to know what to do. So in this case, we will have Redux in here, the association will get back the orientation. Then depending on that orientation, we could return null. And then in the other pages, once we have this nav control, the nav control will decide, okay, am I gonna show the regular for the purpose of a mobile device, or am I gonna show the desktop version of the navigation? Additionally, since I also have Redux set up here, and I'm also using, I'm pretty sure I'm using hooks Redux. Let me double check that. Oh no, I'm not. Okay, well, in this new app, we're gonna have to switch to using hooks. So anyway, if you use the create store, you take basically your root reducer, which is a combination of all other reducers. And then if you're using middleware, you pass middleware. And then this guy would be passed to the Redux provider as the store from that call, this call right here. The combination of all the reducers is done from this call, again, part of Redux. And this is passed as an export to the create store. So I'm sure you're all familiar with Redux, but if you're not, a reducer is a filtering mechanism. The parameter signature for all reducers is the same. It's the current state and some action that represents a type and a payload. So then you have a switch statement that looks for a certain type of payload based upon the reducer, and it will return that payload if it matches. If it doesn't, it just returns the state. So yeah, that's it. So I'm gonna bring this code over into the new app, and I will see you in a few. Okay, so here's the implementation of the previous things that I was talking about. So let's start with Redux. We have the provider, and we configure our store through this function. The function is using create store from Redux. It's taking an aggregated root reducer, initial values. It's composing some middleware. In this case, I'm using Thunk. So this root reducer currently only has the orientation reducer, but obviously I'm going to add more. And then this, if you're not familiar with utility classes, is providing the type of, or is creating a type for the root reducer, which is being called app state as an alias. And then here I have related information like the action type, the orientation action object type, a reducer, an orientation action. A reducer is just a filter. So it's going to look for the type that it cares about. And then if it finds it, it's going to return that payload. If not, it's going to return some default. An action is the thing that actually obtains the payload. And I like this schema style with the type and the payload, whatever it may be. In this case, it's a string. So that is the Redux store. Now, why do we need a Redux store? We need a Redux store because we want to share the current orientation of the screen so that based upon that orientation, we can show or hide certain navigation menus. So in order to set the orientation properly, we're going to use two Redux related hooks, useSelector and useDispatch. useSelector is saying that it only wants a certain property of the store. So in this case, that would be the orientation reducer. The useDispatch is creating an instance of a dispatcher, which will ultimately take the updated orientation, convert it to an action type, and then send it to the reducer. So then how do we get the orientation? So the orientation is a state object using useState based upon media queries. So the media query that I'm using is this. Obviously yours may differ, but the key is I'm looking for portrait on mobile devices. So that's how I'm setting the config up. So once I do that, I set up a listener and I set up removal of the listener looking for this match. So if the match is found, it dispatches the orientation action and it passes this as the orientation. So ultimately this value should be mobile portrait if it's a mobile device. So here I'm using useEffect on mount. I'm allowing it, even though I'm using create React app, by having this ESLint disabler of this rule. I don't know why they have this rule for just allowing this. But anyway, so I add the event listener and I allow for its removal. And then what happens is inside of this slide out pane that was on the left hand side, this is the pane that represents the menu. There are two main things. There's the menu itself, and then there's what's basically like React Router switch statement, which is a list of all of the routes. Currently, we just have one. So in this case, if I see that orientation is not a mobile portrait orientation, then I'm just not going to return a menu because I don't want to see the menu from the left. I want to see it on the top toolbar. If it is mobile portrait, then I'm going to show the menu. And then it's going to come in here and get drawn and all that stuff. This is a call to render of our first page on this URL. And it takes as a parameter the orientation. And the reason why it takes that is to see, again, if it's a mobile portrait. If it is, it returns nothing. If it's not a mobile portrait, then it returns the desktop navigation menu. And I'll show you what that looks like after I finish reviewing this. So that's here. And then this in Ionic is the body. And this, again, because it's a page, it represents, the entire screen. This is a header, or the top part. There's also an Ion footer, but I'm not using it. And then this is where your content would show up. So if we look at the desktop menu, All it is a title and a set of buttons represented by icons, which I haven't fully fleshed out yet, but I will. So that is basically what's happening. So if we're in desktop mode, we get a toolbar, nav bar, type, header, and then we get these icons that we can set to whatever we want. And then this again is the body. If this was a mobile device, we wouldn't get that header bar at all. We would just get the standard Ionic header, and we would get this menu on the side, which is what we want for mobile devices. This is actually part of the body, but it's like a header in the body, and then this is the rest of the body. So that's sort of part one of the feature set: navigation and setting up Redux.